They were already closing the aircraft door when the man in the aisle said it out loud. "That bag doesn't belong there." The words cut through the cabin like a dropped glass. Sharp, unwelcome. Every head turned. The overhead bin above row 7 shuddered as the flight attendant's hand froze mid-motion. Her fingers rested on the latch. Her breath caught. For a moment, the only sound was the low mechanical hum of conditioned air pushing through vents that never truly slept. The man who spoke was standing, not seated. That alone was unusual at this stage of boarding. Late 60s, lean frame, grey hair cut short, practical, no effort to hide age, no attempt to look younger than he was. He wore a faded navy windbreaker and brown leather shoes polished by habit, not fashion. The kind of shoes men wore when they believed appearances should earn respect, quietly, not demand it. His name was Daniel Mercer. No one knew that yet. The bag in question was a black duffel, soft-sided, scuffed along the edges. It had been shoved sideways into the bin by a younger passenger moments earlier, a man with a loud voice and restless hands, who smelled faintly of citrus cologne and impatience. The duffel didn't fit cleanly. It pressed against the metal seam, forcing the latch into an awkward angle. The flight attendant, Rachel Kim, felt the tension before she understood it. She had worked cabins for over a decade. You learn to feel trouble before it speaks, twice. "It's fine, sir," she said, forcing calm into her voice. "We're almost ready to push back." Daniel didn't sit. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't repeat himself. He just looked at the bin. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately tracing the slight bulge near the hinge, the faint discoloration on the interior panel, the way the latch resisted instead of clicking clean. "I'm telling you," he said quieter now. "That bag doesn't belong there." The younger man across the aisle scoffed. "It's my bag. It fits. Everyone relax." A few passengers chuckled. Nervous humor, the kind people used when they wanted a problem to belong to someone else. Rachel hesitated. The schedule was already tight. Phoenix was waiting with heat and a full arrival board. The captain wanted the door sealed. Operations wanted on-time departure. And here was a man who looked like someone's retired uncle, slowing everything down. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice as she leaned closer, "if there's a concern, I can note it for the captain after we're airborne." Daniel finally looked at her. Up close, his eyes were pale blue, steady, unsettling in their focus. Not angry, not afraid. Measuring. "You won't get another chance after we're airborne." That landed differently. Rachel felt it. So did the man in the window seat beside Daniel, a white-haired veteran wearing a Korean War cap. His jaw tightened. He'd heard that tone before, decades ago, in places where mistakes didn't get second acts. "What exactly are you saying?" the younger passenger snapped. "You trying to delay the flight?" Daniel turned toward him. Slowly. Fully. "I'm saying," he replied, "that I've seen what happens when people decide discomfort is cheaper than caution." Silence spread. Not the awkward kind, the alert kind. Rachel swallowed. "So do you have a specific concern? Is there something dangerous about the bag?" Daniel glanced at the duffel again, then at the man who owned it, then back to the bin. "It was checked late," he said. "It was rushed, and it's pressing against equipment that shouldn't be under stress during ascent." The younger man laughed, loud and brittle. "You some kind of expert now?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He reached up, tapped the metal frame lightly with 2 fingers. "Listen," he said. They did. A faint click. Not rhythmic, not normal. A tiny sound buried under the cabin noise, but unmistakable once your ears knew where to land. Rachel's stomach tightened. The older veteran leaned forward. "That's not right," he murmured. The younger man shifted, suddenly less confident. "It's probably nothing." "Nothing doesn't click back," Daniel said. Rachel straightened. She pressed the call button for the interphone. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Captain? This is Rachel in the cabin. We have a concern with an overhead bin in row 7. I'd like a moment before door close." A beat. Then the captain's voice measured but firm. "Explain." Before Rachel could answer, another voice cut in from behind. "Rachel, what's going on?" It was Mark Harlan, lead flight attendant, early 50s, crisp uniform, a man who believed problems were best handled quietly, quickly, and out of sight. She gestured to Daniel. "He's concerned about a bag placement." Mark's eyes flicked over Daniel, assessing. Casual clothes, no visible status markers, no airline tags. His expression tightened just enough to register dismissal. So Mark said, "Practiced smile in place, we're about to depart. If there's an issue, you should have mentioned it earlier." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "I did. Just now." "That's not how this works," Mark replied. "If every passenger questioned storage, we'd never leave the gate." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. People wanted to go home. People wanted heat and connection flights and familiar beds. Daniel felt it. The pressure. The weight of eyes silently asking him to sit down and stop being difficult. He didn't. He thought of a different cabin years ago. Different aircraft. Different coast. A sound no one wanted to hear until it was too late. "You're right," Daniel said evenly. "That's not how it works. Until it does." Mark's patience thinned. "Sir, I'm going to need you to take your seat." Daniel didn't move. The veteran beside him shifted, planting his feet. "If he's got a concern," the old man said, voice rough with age, "maybe we listen." A woman across the aisle nodded. "My husband worked maintenance. Sounds matter." Mark exhaled through his nose. This was escalating. He didn't like that. "I'll have ground take a look," he said curtly, already turning toward the interphone. "But we are not delaying this flight for speculation." Daniel finally sat. Slowly, as if he'd said what he came to say. As Mark spoke into the phone, Rachel watched Daniel from the corner of her eye. His hands rested flat on his knees. Still, controlled. But his jaw was set, muscles tight like a man holding something back. The younger passenger stared straight ahead, now avoiding eye contact. Outside the window, a ground technician approached tool belt, swinging lightly. He reached up, opened the bin. The latch resisted. He frowned, touched the frame, listened. Then his expression changed. Inside the cabin, Daniel closed his eyes for just a second. Not relief. Recognition. Whatever came next, the flight was no longer ordinary, and neither was the man everyone had nearly ignored. The technician didn't say anything at first. He just stood there beneath the open bin, staring up at it longer than comfort allowed. That silence traveled fast. Mark felt it crawl up his spine. Rachel felt it in the way the cabin stopped breathing all at once, like a theater just before the curtain rose on something no one had paid to see. The technician reached into the bin, carefully fingertips grazing the duffel as if it might react. He eased it out, inch by inch, setting it gently on the floor. The click stopped the moment the pressure lifted. He ran his hand along the inside panel, then tapped twice, firmer this time. The sound answered back. Hollow. Wrong. He straightened and looked at Mark. This bin shares housing with the emergency oxygen line. The words landed hard. Mark blinked. That's not possible. The technician didn't argue. He simply pointed to the faint crease where metal met plastic. That line runs behind here. If the casing shifts under stress during climb, it can crack. Lose pressure. Rachel felt her throat go dry. Lose pressure, how the technician looked at her. Fast. A low ripple moved through the cabin. People shifted. Seatbelts creaked. A man 2 rows back whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Mark cleared his throat. "Captain needs confirmation." "You'll get it," the technician said. "But I'm grounding this aircraft until maintenance clears the entire section." He turned and walked back toward the jet bridge, already speaking into his radio. The door, half closed moments earlier, was pulled fully open again. Cold air rushed in sharp against the stale warmth of the cabin. For a second, no one moved. Then the murmurs started. "What does that mean? Are we getting off? How long is this going to take?" Mark raised his hands. "Everyone, please remain seated. We are assessing a minor issue." Daniel watched the technician disappear down the jet bridge. He hadn't moved since sitting. He hadn't spoken. But the tension in his shoulders eased just a fraction. The veteran beside him leaned over. "You knew," he said quietly. Daniel didn't answer right away. "I suspected." From what? From the sound. From the way the latch fought instead of failing clean. The old man studied him. "You military used to be adjacent," Daniel replied. Mark turned back toward row 7. Irritation now edged with something else. Unease. He looked at Daniel as if seeing him for the first time. "Sir," he said, "how exactly did you know where that line runs?" Daniel met his gaze. "Because I spent a long time reading accident reports most people never finish." Mark frowned. "You're saying you have aviation experience?" "I'm saying I have risk experience." That wasn't an answer Mark could file neatly away. Rachel stepped closer. "Sir," she said, gently earlier, "you mentioned you've seen what happens when people ignore discomfort." "What did you mean by that?" Daniel looked past her, out the small oval window. The sun was higher now, glare bouncing off the tarmac. "I meant I've watched people talk themselves out of listening, because listening was inconvenient." Behind them, a woman stood despite the seatbelt sign, still glowing. Mid-60s, hair pinned back, voice steady but sharp. "Is this the same kind of inconvenience that leads to hearings later?" A few heads nodded. Mark stiffened. "Ma'am, please sit down." She didn't. "My brother died in an industrial accident because someone ignored a report that slowed production. I'm interested in hearing the rest of this." The cabin shifted again. Less passive now, more alert. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are delaying departure for additional inspection. Safety is our priority. We appreciate your patience." The word safety hung there suddenly heavier than it had been during any pre-flight announcement. Mark rubbed his temple. This was spiraling. He looked back at Daniel. "Sir, I'm going to ask again." "Who are you?" Daniel breathed in slowly. He felt the weight of the question. He also felt the eyes of the cabin, the quiet expectation, the pull toward revelation. "Not yet. I'm someone who doesn't like being wrong about preventable things," he said. Maintenance personnel boarded 2 more this time. They conferred in low voices. One of them glanced toward Daniel, curiosity flickering before professionalism masked it. Rachel watched that exchange closely. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, the captain emerged from the cockpit, tall, silver-haired face, carved by years of command. He spoke briefly with the maintenance lead, then turned to address the cabin directly. "We're going to deplane," he said. "This aircraft will not fly today." A collective exhale. Relief braided with frustration. As passengers stood and gathered their belongings, conversations broke free of whispers. People talked, compared notes, replayed moments. The younger man who owned the duffel avoided Daniel entirely, face flushed, jaw tight. He muttered something about delays and work meetings, but his voice lacked conviction now. Mark stood rigid near the aisle, watching Daniel as he rose, slowly joints, protesting softly. When Daniel stepped into the aisle, Mark spoke under his breath. "You could have said something sooner." Daniel paused. "I did." Mark swallowed. For the first time, his authority felt thin. In the terminal, the gate area filled quickly. Phones came out. News traveled fast when adrenaline was involved. Rachel lingered near the window, watching Daniel speak quietly with the captain. Their conversation was brief, low serious. The captain nodded once sharply, as if a piece had clicked into place. When Daniel turned away, Rachel approached him. "Sir," she said, "I want to thank you." "For what?" "For not letting us rush past something that mattered." He studied her face, saw the sincerity, the fatigue. "You listened," he said. "That counts." She hesitated. "You're not just a passenger, are you?" Daniel smiled faintly. Not warmth, recognition. No. Before she could ask more, Mark joined them, posture stiff but controlled. "The captain says you should speak with operations." Daniel nodded. "I expected that." As they walked toward a quieter corner of the terminal, conversations trailed behind them. Speculation grew. Someone had already posted a short video of the deplaning, captioned with questions. In the glass reflection of a darkened storefront, Daniel caught his own image. Older than most men with power were expected to be, softer around the edges, easy to underestimate. That had always been the point. They stopped near an unused gate. The captain folded his arms. "Mr. Mercer," he said, voice respectful. "Now I ran your name." Daniel met his eyes. And I have questions." "So do I," Daniel replied, "about how many times concerns like this get waved through because they don't come from the right voice." The captain exhaled. "That's a serious allegation. So is ignoring warning signs." Mark shifted uncomfortably. Rachel watched both men, sensing the ground moving beneath familiar hierarchies. The captain studied Daniel again. "You sit on a federal advisory board," he said. "Risk oversight." Daniel didn't correct him. He didn't need to. "And you fly anonymously," the captain continued. "On purpose." "Yes." Why Daniel looked back toward the window, where their aircraft sat quiet and grounded, surrounded by orange vests and flashing lights. Because systems tell the truth when they think no one important is watching. The captain nodded slowly. In the distance, an announcement echoed about rebooking and accommodations. Life continued, but something had shifted. Daniel felt it. Rachel felt it. Even Mark felt it, standing there with his carefully practiced confidence now cracked just enough to let doubt seep in. This wasn't over. It hadn't even properly begun. The first call came before the passengers finished rebooking their flights. It came quietly without ceremony, while Daniel stood near the window, watching ground crews circle the aircraft like cautious surgeons. His phone vibrated once in his pocket. Not a ringtone. Not an alert. Just a single deliberate pulse. He didn't answer it right away. Mark noticed. He had been watching Daniel too closely for someone who claimed not to care. The way Daniel didn't rush. The way he let silence work for him. That was not the posture of a man reacting. It was the posture of a man waiting for the world to catch up. Rachel leaned against the counter, arms folded, exhaustion settling into her shoulders. She had replayed the moment in her head, Already the click in the bin, the technician's face, the shift in the room. She knew this would follow her, not as fear, as clarity. The captain returned from a conversation with operations, his expression altered, sharpened. "Mr. Mercer, he said they're escalating this." Daniel nodded. "They should." The captain hesitated. "You're aware this is already being logged at a level above routine safety reporting?" "I'm aware." "And you're comfortable with that?" Daniel finally looked at him. Comfort is not the metric. The phone vibrated again. Daniel stepped a few paces away and answered. "Yes," he said. A pause. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No, I don't need counsel present yet." Another pause. Because nothing I said was speculative, it was observable. He listened, nodded once. "Then you understand why I didn't announce myself." The call ended. Mark cleared his throat. "Operations wants a statement from you." Daniel turned. "They can wait." "That's not how this usually works," Mark replied, but the words lacked their earlier certainty. Daniel studied him for a moment, not unkindly. That's how it works when the process assumes cooperation instead of integrity. Mark stiffened. "Are you implying I'm implying that your system responded exactly as it was trained to?" Rachel watched Mark's face color. She saw the conflict there, defensiveness wrestling with something older and harder to shake. A man approached them from the terminal corridor, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a blazer that didn't belong to any airline uniform. His badge was clipped low, deliberately unobtrusive. "Daniel Mercer," he said. Not a question. Daniel nodded. "Ethan Cole." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You remember?" "You prefer people not to," Daniel replied. Ethan glanced around, then gestured toward a quieter seating area. "We should talk." They sat. Mark and Rachel remained standing, suddenly peripheral to a conversation that had shifted planes. Ethan leaned forward. "You've just triggered a multi-agency review." Daniel folded his hands. "I triggered attention. The review was overdue. You grounded an aircraft. I delayed a mistake." Ethan exhaled. "You could have handled this through channels." Daniel's voice stayed even. "I was inside the channel. It asked me to sit down." Ethan studied him. "You know what comes next?" "Yes." "Media?" "Yes." "Politics?" "Yes." "And consequences?" Daniel held his gaze. "Good." Rachel felt a chill. Not fear, recognition. This was bigger than policy, bigger than procedure. Ethan turned, slightly lowering his voice. "You didn't just flag a maintenance issue. You exposed a behavior pattern." Daniel didn't blink. "I observed one. That aircraft wasn't the first to have a delayed response," Ethan continued. "Just the first where the delay met a witness who refused to be small." Mark's breath caught. He hadn't meant to listen. He couldn't stop. Rachel spoke carefully. "What does that mean?" Ethan looked at her. "It means this is no longer about one bin." Daniel rose slowly. It never was. Across the terminal, a television flickered to life above a bar. The headline scrolled in muted text. "Flight delayed after safety concern raised by passenger." Someone had uploaded the video. Of course they had. A woman nearby read it aloud. "Passenger." Daniel almost smiled. Ethan checked his phone. "Your anonymity is collapsing." Daniel shrugged. "It always does." "Eventually." Mark stepped forward. "You let us believe you were just another traveler." Daniel met his eyes. "I was." "That's not fair," Mark said, frustration breaking through. "You knew more than we did." "No," Daniel replied quietly. "I noticed more." "There's a difference." Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. His hands curled at his sides. Years of training pressed against a sudden, uncomfortable thought. Rachel broke the silence. If he hadn't spoken up, she said we'd be airborne. No one contradicted her. The captain returned, face tight. We've been instructed to secure statements from crew and passengers. Daniel nodded. I'll provide one. Now. Soon. The captain hesitated, then relented. They've also requested your credentials. Daniel took a breath. The moment had arrived. He felt it settle heavy but familiar. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a slim card. Not flashy. Matte. No logo most people would recognize. He handed it to Ethan. Ethan looked, then looked again. Then he exhaled slowly. You're still listed as inactive, temporarily, Daniel said. Ethan handed the card back, eyes sharp now. This changes the tone. Daniel slipped the card away. It shouldn't. Mark stared at him. What was that? Daniel met his gaze. That was proof that I'm allowed to ask uncomfortable questions without asking permission. Mark swallowed. A cluster of passengers had gathered nearby, pretending not to stare. Phones hovered at chest level. A few recognized Daniel now. Whispers moved like wind through tall grass. Rachel felt it too. The shift from annoyance to curiosity to something like respect. Ethan stood. They're sending a team. Daniel nodded. I'll wait. Ethan paused. You realize this could end careers. Daniel's voice softened just slightly. It already has. Just not the right ones. Ethan didn't argue. As he walked away, Mark remained rooted, the weight of the day pressing down. He looked at Daniel, searching for accusation. He found none. Why not say who you were? Mark asked quietly. Why let it go this far? Daniel considered him. Because systems don't reveal their cracks when they think they're being judged. They reveal them when they think they're safe. Mark closed his eyes briefly. Rachel watched Daniel turn back toward the window. The aircraft still sat there silent, grounded. For the first time that day, the terminal felt honest. They arrived without sirens. 2 men and a woman, all in neutral coats, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who never needed to announce authority. They didn't look like a team until they stood together, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Then the air around them changed. Daniel felt it before he saw them. Ethan turned, straightened slightly. That'll be them. The woman led, early 40s, dark hair pulled back, tight eyes, sharp but tired. She held a thin tablet against her chest, like a shield that had seen too many battles. Daniel Mercer, she said. Not a question. I'm Laura Bennett, Federal Transportation Oversight. Daniel inclined his head. You're early. We reprioritized, Laura replied, gaze flicking briefly toward the grounded aircraft. You tend to have that effect. Mark watched from a few steps away, heart pounding. This was no longer a workplace issue. This was something else. Something heavier. Laura looked at him. You're the lead attendant on this flight, yes? Mark said, voice steady despite himself. And you instructed the cabin to proceed with departure before the inspection. Mark swallowed. I followed protocol. Laura nodded slowly. We'll come back to that. She turned back to Daniel. We'd like a private room. Daniel gestured toward an unused airline office near the gate. That'll do. Inside the room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. Laura set her tablet down the screen, lighting up with schematics, timelines, logs. We've reviewed preliminary data, she said. This isn't the first report of stress interference near that housing. Daniel leaned against the desk. It's the first time someone didn't let it slide. Laura studied him. You chose a visible moment. I chose a real one. She tapped the screen. 3 prior incidents, all flagged by cabin observations, all downgraded before full inspection. Mark's chest tightened. He hadn't known that. Laura glanced at him. "Do you remember those?" Mark hesitated. "I remember delays. I remember being told not to overreact." Daniel watched his face carefully. Not to judge, to understand. Laura turned back to Daniel. "You were flagged in our system years ago. Risk evaluation, infrastructure oversight." "Retired," Daniel said. "Dormant," Laura corrected. "You stepped back? You didn't disappear?" Daniel's jaw set. "I stepped back because the work stopped listening." Laura's eyes softened just a fraction. And now it's louder." She nodded. "Your presence here forced a chain reaction. The airline is scrambling. Corporate has already reached out. Of course they have. They're concerned about exposure." Daniel almost smiled. "They should be concerned about pattern." Laura leaned back. "You understand what happens next? Investigations," Daniel said. "Depositions, quiet settlements if no one's careful. And public pressure," she added. "You're already trending." Mark flinched. Trending, Rachel appeared at the door phone in hand. "There's video," she said softly, "of the bin, of the delay." Someone added commentary. Daniel didn't look surprised. "Did they add context?" "Not yet." Laura exhaled. "They never do at first." She stood. "Mr. Mercer, we're placing a temporary hold on similar aircraft models pending review." Daniel straightened. "That's the right call. It's also going to cause disruption." "Yes." "And backlash?" "Yes." Laura held his gaze. "You're comfortable with that?" Daniel's voice was calm. "I'm familiar with it." She turned to Mark. "I'll need your full cooperation." Mark nodded quickly. "Of course." As Laura and her team stepped out, the room felt suddenly smaller. Rachel leaned against the wall, eyes wide. "This is getting big," she whispered. Daniel looked at her. It was always big. It just hid well. In the terminal, the crowd had grown. Reporters now, microphones. Questions shouted toward anyone who looked official. A man in a tailored suit approached, flanked by airline staff. Early 50s. Polished, smile fixed too tight. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Extending a hand Daniel did not immediately take. "Thomas Gray, Senior Vice President of Operations." Daniel regarded the hand, then shook it briefly. "You're late." Thomas chuckled nervously. "We moved as fast as we could." "I'm sure." They stepped aside, cameras tracking their movement like predators sensing weakness. Thomas lowered his voice. "We'd like to resolve this internally." Daniel's eyes hardened. "This is not internal anymore." Thomas sighed. "You're forcing a narrative." Daniel leaned in slightly. "You wrote the narrative when you taught your people which warnings mattered." Thomas stiffened. "That's unfair." "Then disprove it," Daniel replied. Thomas glanced around, saw Laura conferring with staff, saw reporters circling. "What do you want?" Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "Transparency, accountability, and a pause long enough to hear what your system has been trying to tell you." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "This could ground half our fleet." Daniel didn't blink. Or save it. The silence between them stretched. Thomas nodded slowly. "We'll cooperate." "Good," Daniel said. "Then start by not spinning." As Thomas retreated, Mark approached Daniel, face pale. "I didn't know," he said. "About the other reports." Daniel studied him. "I believe you. That doesn't fix it." "No." Daniel agreed. "But it tells me where to start." Mark swallowed. Am I in trouble?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "That depends on what you do next." Mark nodded, the weight of it settling in. The announcement came over the terminal speakers moments later. All flights of that aircraft type were temporarily suspended, pending inspection. Groans, frustration. then slowly something else. Relief. An older woman near the gate clutched her purse and whispered to her husband, "I'm glad they're checking." Daniel heard it. He closed his eyes briefly. Later, as the terminal buzzed with rearranged plans and tempered anger, Laura returned. "We're convening a preliminary review panel tonight," she said. "I want you there." Daniel nodded. "I'll attend." She hesitated. "Off the record, you rattled a cage that hasn't moved in years." Daniel met her gaze. "Cages don't open themselves." She left him with that. Rachel watched him from a distance, curiosity burning. She approached slowly. "Why keep flying like this?" she asked. Anonymous. Alone. Daniel smiled faintly. "Because systems reveal their truth to the people they think don't matter." She nodded, absorbing it. Outside the windows, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the grounded plain. A machine built to move, forced to stop. Daniel stood there quiet amid the noise, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. Not the scrutiny, not the headlines, the reckoning. And this time it would not be deferred. The review panel convened in a room that had never been meant for truth. It sat above the terminal glass, walled on 3 sides, designed for optimism. Runway views, polished tables, the illusion that altitude brought clarity. Tonight it brought exposure. Daniel took the chair closest to the window. Not by design, by habit. He liked seeing the systems he was being asked to talk about. Laura Bennett entered last, closing the door behind her with a soft, deliberate click. The sound carried more weight than any gavel. Around the table sat people who had spent decades mastering the art of appearing prepared. Airline executives, safety directors, legal counsel. Men and women whose careers had been built on managing risk without ever letting it feel personal. Daniel felt their eyes on him, measuring, cataloguing, trying to place him in a mental filing cabinet where discomfort could be minimized. Laura spoke first. "This is a preliminary session. No press. No recordings. We are here to understand sequence and pattern." She looked at Daniel. "You initiated the disruption. You start." Daniel didn't clear his throat, didn't adjust his posture. He simply began. "I boarded a routine flight. I noticed a deviation. I raised it. I was asked to sit down." He let the words settle. "I did not escalate. I did not demand. I observed what happened when a concern came from someone who did not fit the profile your system prioritizes." A man across the table, silver hair, expensive watch, leaned forward. "With respect, you're making assumptions about intent." Daniel met his gaze. "I'm describing outcomes," another executive interjected. "Our crews are trained to balance efficiency with safety." Daniel nodded. "Your crews are trained to balance efficiency with hierarchy." The room shifted. Laura watched closely. A woman near the end of the table spoke up, voice controlled. "Are you suggesting discrimination?" "I'm suggesting filtration," Daniel replied. "You filter information based on who delivers it, not what it contains." The legal counsel frowned. "That's a serious accusation." "So is an oxygen line under stress," Daniel said quietly. Laura raised a hand. "Let's stay factual." Daniel inclined his head. "Facts are why I'm here." He gestured toward the window. That aircraft would have departed if not for a sequence of small resistances. Not protocols. People. Mark sat against the far wall, invited but not centered. He felt every word land like a stone. Daniel continued. "This isn't about blame. It's about pattern recognition. And your pattern tells certain people their discomfort matters more than others' observations." An executive scoffed softly. "You expect us to believe this is systemic, based on one incident?" Laura tapped her tablet. It's not one. She projected data onto the glass wall. Rows of reports, timestamps, downgrades, notes that said things like passenger misinterpretation and no action required. Daniel watched the color drain from a few faces. Laura spoke evenly. 3 prior incidents matched the same profile. Cabin-level observations, delayed validation, elevated only after secondary confirmation. The silver-haired executive leaned back. Correlation is not causation. Daniel turned to him. When the same voices are ignored repeatedly, correlation becomes instruction. Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Laura looked at Daniel. Why didn't you intervene sooner? With your credentials, Daniel considered the question carefully. Because when authority announces itself, systems perform. When it stays quiet, systems reveal. Another executive shook his head. That's entrapment. No, Daniel replied. That's observation. The woman executive spoke again. What do you want from us? Daniel didn't hesitate. A pause. A real one. Enough time to listen without defending. The legal counsel stiffened. A pause costs money. Daniel's eyes flicked toward him. So does catastrophe. Laura closed her tablet. We are recommending a temporary grounding of all aircraft with similar housing configurations. A sharp inhale rippled around the table. That's extreme, someone said. It's responsible, Laura replied. Daniel added, and overdue. Mark shifted, unable to stay silent. If this goes through, he said, voice tight, front line. Staff will take the hit. Daniel looked at him. Only if leadership lets them. Mark swallowed. Laura stood. We'll reconvene after initial inspections. As people filed out conversations hushed and urgent, Daniel remained seated. Rachel slipped in, quietly standing near the door. You okay? She asked. Daniel nodded. I've been in worse rooms. She hesitated. They're talking about you. He smiled faintly. They always do. Down in the terminal, the announcement echoed. Flights cancelled. Apologies issued. Rebooking in progress. Anger flared, then softened. A man in a wheelchair rolled past Daniel, guided by an attendant. He looked up. They say someone spoke up, he said. Good. Daniel met his eyes. We all should. Later alone, near the window again, Daniel's phone rang. He answered without looking. Yes. A familiar voice replied, older, steadier. You finally did it. Daniel smiled slightly. You told me to wait for the right moment. I told you to wait until it mattered. Daniel watched maintenance crews swarm the grounded planes. It always mattered. The voice on the line softened. You ready for what comes next? Daniel exhaled. I never am. I go anyway. When he ended the call, Laura stood beside him. They're pushing back, she said. Hard. Daniel nodded. They would. You realize this could change how oversight works. I hope it does. She studied him. Why keep carrying this alone? Daniel looked out at the runway lights, flickering on as dusk settled. Because when too many people carry it, it gets diluted. Laura smiled sadly. You're not wrong. As night fell, inspections continued. Findings emerged. Not catastrophic, but close enough to matter. By morning, the narrative would be out of their hands. Daniel knew that. He also knew something else. For the first time in a long while, the system was listening, not because it was forced to, but because it had been caught in the act of not listening at all. And that truth, once seen, could not be unseen. Morning didn't arrive gently. It arrived with screens already lit, voices already raised, and Daniel Mercer's name spelled wrong more than once. He stood in the hotel room overlooking the airport curtains, half open, watching the first departures of the day. crawl down runways that would soon grow quiet. Coffee cooled untouched on the desk. He hadn't slept. Not from nerves, from calculation, the kind that keeps the mind moving long after the body wants to stop. His phone vibrated again. Laura Bennett's name this time. "It's moving faster than we expected," she said the moment he answered. No greeting, no preamble. Daniel watched a baggage cart pass beneath his window. "That's because they're afraid of losing control of the story. They already have," Laura replied. "Corporate put out a statement overnight. Did they apologize?" Daniel asked, or did they express regret without naming behavior? Laura exhaled. The second one. Of course they did. They're framing this as an isolated maintenance anomaly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then they didn't listen. They listened, Laura corrected. They just didn't like what they heard. A knock sounded at Daniel's door, not housekeeping. "Too deliberate. I have to go," Daniel said. When he opened the door, a man stood there in a charcoal suit that had never known a crease out of place. Mid-50s, polished smile, eyes that didn't smile back. "Daniel Mercer," the man said. "I'm Paul Hastings, external counsel." Daniel stepped aside. "You're early." Paul entered, scanning the room. "You've created quite a morning." Daniel closed the door. "Then your clients should stop pretending this began yesterday." Paul set a leather folder on the desk. "They want to talk." Daniel didn't sit. "About what?" "About resolution." Daniel laughed softly. "You're using that word too soon." Paul's smile tightened. "They're prepared to acknowledge concerns." Daniel turned toward the window. "Concerns aren't the issue. Patterns are." Paul opened the folder. "They're offering to fund an independent review. Generous. Public. You'd be involved." Daniel finally faced him. "Involved how?" "As an advisor." Quietly. Daniel studied Paul for a long moment. "You want my credibility without my voice." Paul met his gaze. "I want this to end without burning the house down." Daniel stepped closer. "You built the house on insulation instead of wiring. Fires don't ask permission." Paul's jaw flexed. "Careful." Daniel's voice dropped. "No." "You be careful. You came here because your clients know this isn't about maintenance. It's about who gets believed when the stakes are invisible." Paul closed the folder slowly. "If this escalates, people get hurt." Daniel nodded. "They already did. Just not loudly enough to count." Paul stood. "Think about it." "I already have." Paul left without another word. Daniel checked his phone. Messages stacked now. Reporters, former colleagues, people who hadn't spoken to him in years, suddenly urgent. He ignored them all and left the room. Downstairs, the hotel lobby buzzed with low voices and rolling suitcases. A television above the bar played footage of the grounded aircraft graphics looping. Safety review underway. A woman at the bar pointed at the screen. "That man saved lives," she said. Her companion shrugged, "or delayed my flight." Daniel walked past unnoticed. That anonymity was thinning, but it still held. Outside, Laura waited near a black sedan. She looked tired, focused, unmoved by spectacle. "They're convening a broader panel," she said as he approached. "Congressional interest." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That didn't take long." "They see blood," Laura replied. "Or headlines." Daniel opened the car door. "Same thing now." As they drove, Laura spoke. "They're going to try to make you the story." Daniel stared ahead. "They always do. It's easier than changing structure." "Are you ready for that?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I didn't step back into this to be comfortable." They arrived at a nondescript federal building. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed, indifferent to consequence. In the conference room, faces waited. Some familiar, some not. Power wore many expressions. A senator leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, are you accusing the airline of systemic negligence?" Daniel met his eyes. "I'm describing a system that incentivizes speed over listening." "That's vague," the senator said. "It's precise," Daniel replied. "You just don't like the implication." Another voice cut in. "You flew anonymously." Why Daniel didn't hesitate. Because systems behave differently when they think they're unobserved. A murmur moved through the room. "Are you suggesting," a woman asked carefully, "that airlines respond differently based on perceived passenger authority?" Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Silence followed. Laura watched from the corner, arms folded. She had seen rooms like this before. Truth always made them uncomfortable. A man with a heavy accent spoke. "What would you change?" Daniel leaned forward. "I'd change who gets escalated. I'd remove appearance from credibility. I'd train crews to log discomfort before dismissing it." The senator frowned. "That slows operations." Daniel held his gaze. "So does investigation after loss." The meeting stretched, questions sharpened, lines blurred. By the time Daniel stepped back outside, the sun was high and unforgiving. Rachel stood near the entrance uniform, replaced by jeans and a jacket. She looked nervous, determined. "I heard they're asking about crew training," she said. "They are." She swallowed. "If they ask me to testify," Daniel studied her, "tell the truth. That's not always rewarded." "No," Daniel agreed, "but it's always counted." She nodded slowly. Across the plaza, a man shouted Daniel's name. A camera lifted, then another. Laura stepped in front of him. No statements today. Daniel paused, looked at the crowd, faces hungry for clarity or blame. He raised his hand slightly. "Just enough." "I'm not here to end anything," he said, voice carrying without effort. "I'm here to begin listening." He turned away before questions could follow. That evening, alone again, Daniel sat by the window as planes lifted from distant runways. Others stayed grounded. Change never announced itself as victory. It arrived as resistance. And tomorrow, resistance would get louder. The smear didn't arrive as an attack. It arrived as a question. Why did Daniel Mercer fly anonymously? It appeared on a morning news crawl framed as curiosity delivered with polite suspicion. By noon, it had hardened into implication. By evening, it had become motive. Daniel watched it unfold from a quiet corner of a public library 2 miles from the airport, the kind with worn wooden tables and staff who believed silence was a form of respect. He preferred places like this. Institutions that still trusted people to behave without being watched. Across the room, a television mounted high near the ceiling played the segment on loop. The anchor spoke carefully, eyebrows drawn together in concern. "Some are asking whether Mr. Mercer manufactured risk to test the system." Manufactured. The word stuck. Daniel closed his notebook, fingers resting on the cover longer than necessary. He felt the familiar pull of anger, old and disciplined. Anger that had learned over decades how to wait. His phone buzzed. A text from Laura. "They've moved from defense to discredit." Daniel replied with one word. Expected. The hearing room that afternoon was larger than the last. Higher ceiling, better microphones, less patience, faces arranged in a careful arc of power and skepticism. Daniel took his seat without looking for anyone in particular. He knew who would be there. He knew who wouldn't. The airline's counsel opened with a calm statement about cooperation, transparency, and commitment to safety. Words polished smooth by repetition. Then came the pivot. "Mr. Mercer," the counsel said, tone respectful but sharpened. Can you explain why you chose not to identify yourself, knowing your background would influence response? Daniel leaned into the microphone. I can. A pause. The room leaned with him. I chose anonymity because credibility should not depend on resume. If a concern is valid, it remains valid regardless of who voices it, a senator interjected. But you knew your silence would provoke error. Daniel met his gaze. I knew my silence would remove distortion. Murmurs rippled. The council pressed. You're suggesting the system fails without external pressure. I'm suggesting the system performs for authority and dismisses uncertainty. That's an accusation. It's an observation, Daniel replied. Supported by your own internal records, a folder slid across the table toward the panel. Laura's doing. Daniel hadn't needed to ask. The council's jaw tightened. Those records are under review. So is your credibility, Daniel said quietly. Later in the hallway, Mark stood near a pillar hands, clasped behind his back, like a man waiting for inspection. He looked older. Not in years. In posture. They're saying I enforced protocol, Mark said when Daniel approached. They're saying that absolves me. Daniel studied him. Does it? Mark swallowed. No. They're also saying you failed to escalate. I did escalate, Mark replied. Just not high enough. Daniel nodded. That's the flaw. Escalation shouldn't require courage. It should require observation. Mark looked at him, eyes tired. They offered me protection, if I stay aligned. And will you? Mark hesitated, then shook his head. I've spent my career telling people to trust the process. I don't get to hide behind it now. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, respect. Rachel testified that afternoon. She sat straight, hands folded, voice steady despite the attention. She described the sound, the resistance of the latch, the look on the technician's face. She described how she felt dismissed before she felt alarmed. They taught us to manage panic, she said, not to ignore instinct. The room listened. Outside, the narrative fractured. Some outlets doubled down, painting Daniel as an unelected regulator playing God. Others shifted tone, focusing on pattern, not personality. A blogger uncovered something the airline hadn't counted on. A memo. Old. Buried. A recommendation from years earlier, advising redesign of the housing near emergency lines. Deferred. Budget constraints. Daniel read it alone that night, sitting on the edge of his hotel bed. He didn't smile. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired. Laura called moments later. They're scrambling. Because they've been found, Daniel said. Because someone leaked the memo. Daniel closed his eyes. Good. That leak wasn't authorized. Daniel opened them. Neither was the silence that followed it. There was a knock at his door. Mark stood there, jacket in hand. I thought you should hear this from me. Daniel stepped aside. They're moving me off active duty, Mark said. Administrative leave. Daniel nodded. That's pressure. They also offered early retirement. And Mark exhaled. I declined. Daniel looked at him surprised. I don't want to leave like that, Mark said. I want to leave clean, or stay honest. Daniel extended his hand. Mark took it, grip firm, unsteady. Later that night, Daniel walked alone along the edge of the airport perimeter. Chain-link fence, sodium lights, the sound of distant engines lifting without him. He thought of the first time he'd sat in a room like this decades ago, young and underestimated. Thought of the compromises he'd made then, the ones he hadn't. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number, he answered. They're offering a settlement, the voice said. Public acknowledgement. Funding. Quiet exit. Daniel stopped walking. For me. For this. Daniel stared through the fence at the dark outline of grounded planes. "I don't want a quiet exit." Silence on the line. "What do you want?" the voice asked carefully. Daniel spoke slowly. "I want the system to change when I'm gone. Not because I was here." The line went dead. Behind him, a plane roared into the skylights, streaking across the dark. Daniel watched it climb, thinking of everything that still hadn't been said. The story was no longer about a flight, or a bin, or a delay. It was about who the system listened to when no one important was supposed to be watching, and that story was far from finished. The first resignation came just after sunrise. It wasn't announced with urgency. It slipped out through a regulatory filing, a single line, buried beneath earnings forecasts and forward-looking language. Chief Safety Officer stepping down, effective immediately. No explanation offered. No farewell tour. Daniel read it on his phone while standing in line at a diner near the interstate, the kind that served eggs all day and remembered regulars by posture, not name. The waitress poured his coffee without asking. He nodded thanks, eyes still on the screen. Laura's message followed seconds later. "That didn't take long," Daniel typed back. "Pressure reveals priorities." Across the diner, two truckers argued softly about weather patterns. Someone laughed at a joke that didn't quite land. Life continued. Systems shifted quietly. By mid-morning, a second resignation surfaced, then a third. Not all from the airline, from oversight bodies, from consulting firms tied too closely to recommendations that had gone nowhere. The narrative changed tone. Less curiosity now, more teeth. Daniel left the diner and drove toward the airport perimeter, again not to be seen, but because proximity helped him think. He parked near a service road, where planes taxied slow and heavy engines, idling like restrained beasts. His phone rang. Unknown number again. "This is Senator Walsh," the voice said. Older, tired, used to being obeyed. Daniel listened. "We're forming a joint task group," Walsh continued. "Independent. I want you advising it." Daniel watched a ground crew member signal with two bright wands, choreography precise. "In what capacity?" "Officially," Walsh said. "Publicly." Daniel considered the word. "That makes me the story. It makes you the shield," Walsh replied. "They'll focus on you instead of dismantling the effort." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "That assumes the effort survives scrutiny." "That's why we need you." Daniel opened his eyes. "You don't need me. You need resolve." A pause. "We need both." Daniel exhaled. "I'll advise. I won't chair." Walsh hesitated. "That limits authority. It preserves purpose," Daniel said. "If this hinges on me, it collapses when I leave." Another pause. "Understood." The call ended. At the same time, across town, Thomas Gray sat in a boardroom with walls of glass and a view he no longer enjoyed. Charts glowed on screens. Words like exposure and liability floated through the air. "Public trust is eroding," someone said. "It was thin to begin with," another replied. Thomas rubbed his temples. "We cannot let Mercer define us. He already has a woman," said quietly. "By showing us to ourselves." Silence followed. No one liked that sentence. Back at the terminal, Rachel sat through retraining modules that felt suddenly different. Not because the slides had changed, because she had. Each scenario now carried weight. Each choice echoed. Mark sat 2 rows behind her, posture, rigid jaw set. He had turned down early retirement twice now. The third offer sat unanswered in his inbox. During a break, he leaned toward Rachel. "They're rewriting procedure." Rachel nodded. "They're rewriting trust." Outside, reporters clustered again. This time they weren't shouting Daniel's name. They were shouting questions at executives who couldn't answer without contradicting yesterday's statements. A clip went viral. A former engineer, grey-haired and blunt, speaking into a phone camera from his garage. "We flagged that design years ago," he said. "They told us to stop worrying." Daniel watched the clip alone in his hotel room that night. He replayed it once, then again. Not for validation, for memory. He called Laura. How many more like him? Enough, she replied. Enough to break the pattern. Daniel nodded unseen. Patterns don't break. They bend until they snap. The next morning, the task group met for the first time. Long table. Mixed loyalties. Eyes sharp. Daniel took a seat near the end. Not central. Observational. They talked metrics, timelines, scope. Then someone asked the question everyone was circling. Why did it take an outsider? The room stilled. Daniel spoke without raising his voice. Because insiders learn which alarms matter and which ones make trouble. A man scoffed. That's cynical. Daniel met his gaze. It's trained. Laura intervened. We're not here to assign moral failure. We're here to redesign response. Daniel nodded. Response follows belief. They broke for lunch. Daniel stepped outside, needing air. A woman approached him hesitantly. Mid-40s, airport badge, maintenance supervisor. My team's been quiet for years, she said. We didn't think anyone wanted to hear it. Daniel studied her face. Do you still have records? She nodded. We never stopped keeping them. Good, Daniel said. Bring them. By afternoon, documents flowed. Not leaks, contributions. The system began to show its skeleton. Late that night, another call. This one from Paul Hastings. They're pulling the offer, Paul said. Daniel didn't ask which offer. They're preparing a counter-narrative, Paul continued. They'll say this was unforeseeable, that you overreached. Daniel smiled faintly. That's predictable. They'll question your motive. They already are. Paul hesitated. You could still step away. Daniel looked at the city lights beyond the window. I already stepped away once. It didn't help. Silence. What happens, Paul asked, if they make this personal? Daniel's voice was calm. Then they've run out of arguments. The next morning, the hearing room was full again. Cameras this time. Daniel took the seat offered and didn't adjust the microphone. A congresswoman leaned forward. Mr. Mercer, critics say you engineered this moment. Daniel met her gaze. I noticed it. That's evasive. No, Daniel replied. It's precise, another lawmaker interjected. Do you deny that your actions caused economic disruption? Daniel nodded once. I affirm it. Gasps. Whispers. And do you accept responsibility? Daniel didn't pause. For delay, yes. For danger, no. The room quieted. Delays can be recovered, Daniel continued. Lives cannot. That sentence travelled far. By evening, editorials shifted again. Words like courage and inconvenient truth appeared where skepticism had lived. Rachel read them on her phone during her commute, heart-pounding. Mark read them too, sitting at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug, gone cold. Daniel stood once more by the window, watching planes lift into darkening sky, knowing the reveal everyone expected was still ahead. Knowing they were circling not his title but his patience. He was not done waiting. Because the final truth was never about who he was. It was about who they had chosen to ignore. The reveal didn't happen on television. It happened in a document. A dry, unadorned filing released just after markets closed, timed to avoid panic but not scrutiny. A disclosure required by law, long delayed, finally surfaced. Under pressure, no one could absorb any more. Daniel Mercer's name appeared on page 3. Not as a witness, not as an advisor, as a controlling stakeholder. The language was precise. Indirect holdings, blind trusts, long-term positions accumulated quietly over decades, a significant share in the parent investment group that held leverage across multiple carriers, maintenance contractors, and safety consulting firms. Enough influence to ask questions that did not need permission. Enough distance to walk away without being noticed. Phones exploded. Daniel was in the same library as before, seated at the same worn table, the same sunlight filtering through tall windows. He read the document once, then closed it. He had known this moment would come. He had also known it would land differently than people expected. Across the room, someone gasped softly at their phone. A man whispered, he owned part of it. Another voice replied, he could have shut it down years ago. Daniel stood, returned the chair to its place, and walked out without looking back. By the time he reached the street, the narrative had already fractured again. They called him calculating, then restrained, then dangerous in a new way. Why didn't he intervene earlier? Why test a system he had power over? Why let it fail publicly? Laura called before the questions reached him directly. They're spinning it hard, she said. They're saying you manufactured the crisis to force reform. Daniel stopped walking. Traffic hissed past, indifferent. And are they wrong? Laura hesitated. That depends on how you define manufacture. Daniel exhaled. I didn't create the fault. I refused to prevent it from revealing itself. That distinction won't matter to everyone. It never does. Inside the task group, tension peaked. Some members felt betrayed. Others felt relieved. Now the outline of power was visible. Now the invisible hands had a face. A senior advisor slammed a folder shut. He played us. Laura shook her head. He played the system. That's semantics. No. Laura replied. That's accountability. Rachel watched the coverage from her apartment knees, drawn up on the couch. She replayed the clip of Daniel, walking silently past reporters refusing comment. The words didn't match the man she'd seen on the plane. Not the stillness, not the restraint. Mark watched too from his kitchen table, resignation letter still unsigned. He felt something close to shame, but also something like relief. The truth was out now. Ugly. Complicated. Real. At the airline headquarters, Thomas Gray sat with his board. The reveal had stripped away their last line of defense. He controlled exposure, one director said. He forced us into compliance. Thomas stared at the screen. He forced us into visibility. A woman at the end of the table spoke quietly. We deferred that redesign for 7 years. No one contradicted her. That night, Daniel finally accepted an interview. Not live, not exclusive. Recorded. One camera, one questioner. The journalist leaned forward. Why didn't you stop it sooner? Daniel didn't blink, because stopping it silently would have preserved the illusion. You could have saved disruption. Yes, Daniel said. And learned nothing, the journalist pressed. You had power. Daniel nodded. And power that prevents failure without correcting cause ensures repetition. Silence hung between them. So you let it happen, the journalist said. Daniel corrected him. I let it speak. The clip aired without edits. It ran everywhere. Reaction was fierce, polarized, unforgiving. Some called him a hero. Others called him arrogant. Many called him dangerous. Daniel accepted all of it. None of it surprised him. The next morning, Laura met him outside the federal building. She looked tired, resolute. They want you to testify again, she said, about conflict of interest. Daniel nodded. I expected that. And they want you to step down from advisory roles. Daniel smiled faintly. That was always temporary. Laura studied him. You could still salvage your reputation. Daniel met her gaze. I'm not building one. Inside the hearing, the room buzzed with anticipation. This was the moment everyone thought they'd been waiting for. The fall. The exposure. A congressman leaned forward, voice sharp. Mr. Mercer, you stood to gain from grounding those aircraft. Daniel nodded. Yes. A ripple of surprise. And you chose not to act earlier, knowing lives could be at risk. Daniel's voice stayed steady. I chose not to hide the risk. There is a difference. That's convenient, the congressman snapped. Daniel leaned closer to the microphone. What's convenient is intervening quietly, issuing a press release, and letting the system continue unchanged. What's uncomfortable is allowing the system to reveal its priorities in public. The room stilled. You sacrificed trust, the congressman said. Daniel shook his head slowly. I exposed it. Another lawmaker spoke. Do you regret it? Daniel answered without pause. No. Gasps. Murmurs. Do you believe the public was endangered? Daniel's jaw tightened. I believe the public was already endangered. I believe pretending otherwise is what endangered them. Laura watched from the side, heart pounding. This was the edge, the line where history decided whether someone was villain or catalyst. The chair called for order. Final question. The journalist from the night before watched from the back, pen still. The congressman leaned forward. If you had it to do over again, would you reveal yourself sooner? Daniel looked around the room, at faces trained to evaluate risk without feeling it, at power accustomed to being unseen. I revealed myself exactly when the system stopped listening, he said. Any sooner, and this would have been about me. Any later, and it would have been too late. Silence followed. Not hostile, not approving. Heavy. Outside, the world waited. Stock tickers paused. Newsrooms held breath. Daniel stood, collected his papers, and walked out, alone. In the hallway, Rachel waited. Mark stood beside her. They grounded the fleet permanently, Rachel said. New housing design, mandatory review. Mark added, and they rewrote escalation authority. Crew-level overrides. Daniel nodded. Good. They walked together toward the exit. Outside, cameras flashed. Questions flew. Daniel didn't stop. He felt lighter now. Not absolved. Not celebrated. Done. Behind him, the system trembled, then began to reassemble itself under a different weight. And for the first time, it was not built to ignore the quietest voice in the room. The morning after the testimony arrived without ceremony. No headlines screamed his name anymore. No cameras waited outside the apartment Daniel Mercer had borrowed for the week. The noise had not disappeared. It had simply moved deeper into committees, drafts, revised procedures, quiet memos that would never trend but would decide how things worked for decades. Daniel stood at the window, coffee untouched, watching a city wake up the way cities always do, unaware of the machinery beneath them, shifting one gear at a time. He did not feel victorious. He felt finished. Laura arrived just after 8, coat still on phone, buzzing in her hand. She did not sit down. She rarely did when something mattered. The final compliance order came through at dawn, she said. Fleet-wide redesign is locked. Independent oversight is permanent. Congressional language is stronger than expected. No carve-outs. Daniel nodded once. Good. They also removed discretionary authority from executive offices. No more quiet overrides. That was the most dangerous part. Laura studied him. They're calling it the Mercer Standard. He grimaced faintly. That will fade, maybe she said. but the structure won't. In another part of the city, Rachel stood in a hangar with a hard hat pressed too tight against her hair. She watched technicians install a redesigned housing, the metal gleaming, clean, unforgiving. She remembered the sound that started it all, the way she had almost convinced herself it was nothing. Mark stood beside her, hands in his pockets. He no longer wore the company badge. He wore something simpler now, a consultant tag for an independent safety review board that did not exist a month ago. "They're slower," he said. "But they're listening." Rachel smiled faintly. "I'll take slower." At the airline headquarters, Thomas Gray packed the last box from an office that no longer belonged to him. He had resigned quietly. Not forced, not praised, simply acknowledged as part of a system that needed fewer shadows. He paused at the door, looked back once, then turned off the light. Across the country, training rooms filled with people who had never heard Daniel's voice, but would feel his absence. Procedures were rewritten, checklists expanded. Escalation no longer depended on who spoke loudest or carried the right title. A junior mechanic raised a concern without apology. A flight attendant logged a report without fear. A manager read it without dismissing it. None of them knew his name. That was the point. Daniel boarded a train 2 days later, heading north. No security, no assistant, just a seat by the window and a folded newspaper he never opened. As the countryside slid past, he allowed himself one rare moment of reflection. Not pride, not regret, something quieter. Relief. He had not saved a system. He had forced it to stop pretending. At the next stop, a woman recognized him. She hesitated, then nodded. No autograph, no photo, just acknowledgement. Daniel returned it. The train moved on. Weeks passed, then months. The story changed shape as stories do. It became a case study, a policy reference, a line item in a regulatory manual. It lost the drama and kept the consequence. Daniel returned to the library where it had ended and begun. Same table, same light, different silence. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened a notebook. He did not write about airlines. He wrote about thresholds, about the moment systems stop correcting themselves, about how power reveals character when it is unobserved, about how the most dangerous failures begin not with malice, but with convenience. When he finished, he closed the notebook and left it on the table without his name. Outside, the city moved indifferent and alive. Somewhere above, an aircraft lifted cleanly into the sky, its ascent smooth, unremarkable, safe, in ways no passenger would ever notice. A crew member glanced at a panel, logged a reading, followed protocol, without thinking about who had once refused to be moved. That was how change was supposed to look. Quiet, structural, permanent. Daniel walked into the crowd and disappeared again, exactly as he preferred. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments with these 3 words: stay where you belong,